Hello everybody. In this video I want to talk about my trip to Iceland that I took about a month ago. Had a lot of trouble uh, kind of conceptualizing what a video about this would be like because it touched on so many different disparate topics, some of which are pretty interesting and relevant in terms of libertarianism, some of which are pretty interesting and not relevant to libertarianism, and it's just been very kind of hard to think of a way to kind of weave it all together. And then I realized, what the fuck, it's my channel. I don't have to weave it all together. It can be a mess if I want it. If there might be some stuff in this video you find interesting, there might be stuff that you don't find interesting. And, what can I say? Um, that's really kind of true with any video anyway. So I guess, some of my friends from Iceland asked if I was going to make a video about it. I said that I would. It was definitely a very interesting experience for me personally. It was almost like a watershed event. Um, I have, I want to say, flirted with Iceland for a long time. I became interested in Iceland because of my interest in libertarianism, because of the article, especially by David D. Friedman, about the Icelandic Free State, which existed from its founding and up until I think, about the mid 13th century. It's a very fascinating place. I aspired to learn the language, and although I was mostly unsuccessful, I did learn a little bit. In the process of attempting to learn the language, I made a number of friends in Iceland, people that I could talk to. Um, Although I know some people in Iceland who are not libertarians at all, I pretty quickly gravitated towards the idea of approaching libertarians just because then I would have this common footing with them. We'd have something else in common. So I had a whole slew of friends in Iceland that I made maybe in 2007, 2008, maybe even before, I'm not sure. I have a couple Icelandic subscribers, some of whom I've talked with quite a bit over the years. So it was one of those interesting situations where I had, maybe half a dozen friends. Using that term, it could mean someone that I talked to a lot, maybe somebody I only talked to a little bit, who I'd never met, but who I'd had, cordial dialogues with before. Um, I've always wanted to travel. Iceland is actually quite the travel destination right now, and I think I might talk about that a little bit later. Um, and Lots of interesting things have happened there with their bank bailouts, or their non-bank bailouts, which happened in 2008. It's very interesting socially. It's a country that is really changed a lot and is under enormous cultural pressures, which I'm not saying in a negative way necessarily. It's just very, very interesting. So it was quite serendipitous. Basically, a friend of mine who I met at Porkfest, who I think believed I had actually gone to Iceland before when in fact I hadn't. He knew, though, I was interested in it. He contacted me and said that he was planning to go. They were having a gay pride event the first week of August, and he wanted to go to that. And he just wanted to know if I could give him any recommendations on places to go. And to be perfectly honest, I didn't know very many places to go other than the most cliche tourist places like the Blue Lagoon. I went ahead and started asking some of my friends where good places to go, but after about 10 minutes of consideration, I thought I should just go. It was a pretty good time. I haven't had to work very much due to low oil prices, but I was frugal when I did work, so I had plenty of savings. So going to Iceland was not something that was very difficult for me to do. I also had enough airline miles saved up that the transit and about half of the lodging was free, which also helped quite a bit. So, I kind of put out the feelers. I didn't want to impinge on anyone's freedom. There are a lot of these people I haven't talked to in a few years, sometimes many years. I didn't want to assume, a level of amiability that wasn't there. So I took care of all my own housing. I got my own places. I used a service called Airbnb, which I would kind of compare to, if you're not familiar with it, sort of like the Uber of homes. Regular people with a spare room or a spare home will basically rent out rooms to people over the internet. And this happens in the United States, and this happens in Iceland, happens all over the place. And, the quality varies tremendously. I had an excellent experience personally. It's far cheaper than using hotels. And in a lot of ways, it's even better because a lot of times you'll have a kitchen at your disposal, you'll have your own bedroom. They won't have the luxuries of a hotel room, but they'll have basically the comforts of home, which is actually quite nice to have if you're staying someplace for a while. Um, And I think I'll talk about this a little bit later, but I think the the tourist economy and the sites like Airbnb and the cash flow, the international cash flow, is actually kind of producing an interesting power dynamic between the society in Iceland and its overarching state, the government of Iceland. Um, so anyway, I flew to Iceland, and a good friend of mine who I know on YouTube, and I won't say his real name, but his name here is Crazy Pants. Crazy Pants came and picked me up from the airport, which I very much appreciated. And the airport is Keflavik Airport, which was originally actually a U.S. Air Force base. And a lot of people in the United States are unaware of this, and this isn't just true for Iceland, but they're unaware of the footprint left by the U.S. military around the world. And in Iceland, this is actually a pretty big footprint. The cultural impact of the American essentially occupation of Iceland right before the United States entered World War II in 1940 or 1941, and just a little cloudy on the history exact dates, but basically in 1940, Iceland was a colony, a territory of Denmark. And when Denmark was overrun by the Nazis in basically April of 1940, um, the Wehrmacht definitely looked at Iceland as a place to place potential bases, at least weather stations. I think if they had really had their druthers, they would have wanted to establish actual naval bases there and a military presence. That would have been very difficult, but not impossible. Obviously, the British, though, would not allow this, and they basically occupied the island, very invasion style. And a year later, I think before the United States even entered the war, the U.S. Army, uh, I think in coordination with Lend-Lease, occupied instead, and they said, okay, well, we'll occupy the island, and then the British could have those 30,000 soldiers, which I think was about the number they had there, to go fight elsewhere, which again, not a very neutral act to take part in, but whatever. And the United States established naval and air force bases in Iceland and military bases. And some of those barracks are still there. I saw a few of them, and one of the main air bases was set up about 20 miles from Reykjavik, the capital, at a place called Keflavik, and that is where the international airport remains today. So when you fly, there is an airport in Reykjavik, but it doesn't take that many international flights, if any. I don't think it's more of a regional airport. But if you take an international flight to Iceland, you will land in Keflavik, which is about 20 miles from Reykjavik, although you can see it across the bay. 20 miles of lava fields and treeless wasteland, apparently. Um, so Iceland is, in a lot of ways, a microstate. I mean, land area wise, it's quite large. It's bigger than Ireland. Um, I think you're looking, I think if you go on circumference, the main road, which isn't following like all the little fjords and inlets, but the main circular highway is something like 950 kilometers. So it's a big landmass, with very few people. And the people that are there are concentrated very heavily in the capital city, Reykjavik, and then its immediately adjacent suburbs like Kopovar, um, Hafnarfjord, or a few other places, um, Akranes. Uh, there's a few larger towns outside this immediate area. The largest one is called Akureyri, which is on the north coast. There's a place that I visited on the southwest coast, a volcanic fishing island called Vestmannaeyjar, which I'll talk about in a little bit later. Um, but really, it's a state where like probably more than 50%, and I think it's upwards of like 70% of the population live in this one metropolitan area, and it's a relatively small area. And then the rest of the island has either nothing or very small towns, even villages. You're talking places with 100 people, 200 people, 1,000, 1,500 would be like a big place. There's a couple towns that they stand out as like the main center, and you're talking about 1,000 people, 1,500 people. Um, and well, there are certainly places in the United States that are that isolated or that small. I've been to places out west that were equally small, and if not anything more isolated. There's no huge urban centers. There's no giant cities. Reykjavik is basically twice the size of Manchester, not even. And Manchester would not be considered a very big city at all. It's like a town. There's nothing on the level of, say, Boston. I know a lot of people would say, "Oh, is it like Boston?" Like, no, Boston is many times larger than the entire country in terms of population, many times. One of my friends pointed out there that the rough ratio of population between Iceland and the United States is 1,000 to 1. It's actually more than that. There's actually more than 1,000 people in the United States for every single person in Iceland, if that gives you any kind of indication. Even compared to the other Scandinavian countries, which I think all of them except for Sweden have, less than 10 million people. If you're talking Denmark, Norway, Finland, I think Sweden has maybe 20, something like that. Um, Maybe not even. Iceland is tiny in comparison to any of them, and so in the Nordic League, Icelandic is not even one of the official languages, although it is allowed to be used like unofficially, apparently. So uh, Iceland has a very interesting kind of fit within like the geopolitical order. It's not in the EU. It's in NATO. Uh, it's culturally Scandinavian, although there's this enormous cultural influence from the United States that has had a profound effect on the country. And that effect is overwhelmingly social. It's secondarily political, and also I would say that it's to a decent degree libertarian. Not again, the United States is not the paragon of libertarianism, but libertarianism very much uh, the is very much an English kind of phenomenon, an Anglo phenomenon. That's where the strongest libertarianism seems to come from. That's where the vast majority of libertarian content comes from. And Icelanders are essentially a bilingual society now, a functionally bilingual society where uh, English is spoken by basically everyone fluently. There's only one person I met the entire time there, elderly bartender on one of the small islands who could not speak fluent English, and this is including really small children. And I think I'll just talk about that for a minute. Like, if you want to visit Iceland, you do not need to speak Icelandic. In fact, if you go to Iceland and you try and speak Icelandic and you're not as good as they are at English, it's not going to work. Because if you try and speak Icelandic to them, and you're not crystal clear, they're gonna know right away that you actually speak English, and they're gonna speak English to you. And it's fascinating to go around Reykjavik and just hear how often English is the language that you hear being spoken. English, 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 and this is especially true, obviously, in the more touristy areas, but even in the less touristy areas, it's quite common. The signs often are bilingual. The menus are going to be bilingual. Obviously, the tourists don't only come from the United States and Great Britain. There's this kind of an interesting thing where the Icelandic government tries to frame English speakers as coming from the UK. So, like when they have signs that indicate the language with flags, they will always use the Union Jack. You never see the US flag, although this is, I think, a little silly since the large majority of the people who are visiting who speak English are coming from the United States. But even if you're from Germany or France or China or Japan or Korea or wherever else, Icelanders aren't going to speak Korean or Chinese. Very few of them are going to speak German or Spanish. Everyone's going to speak English. And so all the tourists, and tourism is probably the biggest industry, certainly in the Reykjavik area, are going to be speaking English. Uh, Not only that, all of the foreign workers, and there's a lot of foreign workers in Iceland, a huge number, they're going to speak English too. And so I got to meet in my Airbnb, one of the homes I stayed at had about a dozen people staying there. I was the only true tourist there. Everyone else there was a foreigner who was there for work or was there for school. There was one guy from Switzerland who was going there for educational purposes. Everybody else had come there because apparently jobs are very easy to get. There's a guy from France, there's a guy from Argentina, from Spain, from Saudi Arabia, from Poland, from Russia, a lot of Russians and Eastern Europeans, from Czechs. And I mean, the French guy told me in particular that they'd always heard that there was work in Iceland, and indeed there was. And this is just kind of an interesting aside. He bought a single plane ticket, had no accommodations, got off the plane, got hired at two separate jobs within one day. This guy has like no experience, like no resume, what so to speak. He became bartender, although he had never been a bartender before. He just lied and said that he had. Um, but everyone at my house from, I think, over 10 different countries, of course, what do we all speak? We all speak English, which, okay, lingua franca, but then nobody speaks Icelandic. No one could speak any Icelandic. I was the only one there who could speak any at all, and they were all kind of amazed, and I could speak hardly any, like almost none. Um, the languages they speak at work with their employers, with their customers, that's the only requirement you really have. If you showed up there and you said, I speak perfect Icelandic, but I don't speak English, you probably couldn't get a job. But if you can speak English, absolutely you can. So very, very interesting. Now, of course, they're taught Icelandic in school, but their media is saturated with American television, American movies, American music. Iceland is the only country in the EU. This is what the guy at the DVD store said. I'm wondering if this isn't also maybe true of some other tiny little municipalities, but he says they're the only country that doesn't dub things in Icelandic. So when a movie is released uh, in France or Germany, assuming it's a popular enough movie, it's going to get dubbed into those languages. In Iceland, they'll put subtitles, but that's it. And they will only the only things that get dubbed are movies that are targeted towards very small children, animated movies like Disney. Um, and years ago, when I was attempting to learn Icelandic, one of the things I wanted to do is purchase Icelandic films that I could then watch. And it wasn't hard to find authentic Italian, or not Italian, authentic Icelandic movies. And I bought a couple of them, and they were basically really shitty because their movie industry is just subsidized by the government and isn't really competitive on any kind of market level. But I thought it would be cool to get movies that I was familiar with, so popular American movies where I already knew the plot, knew what basically the dialogue was in Icelandic, and I was frustrated to find I couldn't find anything that was dubbed. So when I finally went, and I asked some of my friends at the time, and they said, as far as I knew, there was no dubbing. Well, I actually went to a couple of DVD stores and was told straight up, we just don't dub, it doesn't happen. There's not a big enough market. People speak English. They don't want to rock. And I remember way back when Dance with Dragons first came out, which, by the way, I bought in Icelandic. That's not Dance with Dragons, but it's part of the Song of Ice and Fire. Song of Ice and Fire. I remember one of my friends in Iceland posted a photograph of Dance with Dragons that he had just bought, and he was excited because he was going to read it, and it's popular there, as it is in many places, if not more than most places, because it's filmed there among the episodes for the television show. And I asked this guy, "Aren't you interested in, maybe reading it in Icelandic and not in English?" Which at the time there wasn't a translation for it, but eventually there were. There were because I have them now. And he said, "That's, why would I want to read it in Icelandic? I want to read it in the original. I speak English well. I read English well. It would be like you wanting to read Shakespeare in Icelandic or, in French or something. It just doesn't make sense. It's originally written in English. My command of English is superb, and as indeed almost all of them are, especially the younger people. And so why would I want to?" And so they don't. And if you go to a bookstore, and there are many, many bookstores in Iceland, and it is usually credited as being one of the more literate societies, most literate. Sometimes it's said to be the most literate society. It is about 50-50. 50% of the books you'll see are going to be in English and 50% in Icelandic, and then there'll be a spattering of other languages. There'll be some German books and some French books and a few others. But a huge selection in English, and most of the selection in English is only in English. Only a few things are going to be translated into Icelandic. Somebody went to the trouble of translating Ayn Rand, so I have Atlas Shrugged in Icelandic, uh, and Herodotus and a couple others. But I think that's more of like an academic exercise. People are doing that to look, I did it. Again, if you are really an objectivist or really into libertarianism, you would read Ayn Rand in English. And I asked my friends there, all of whom, or most of whom that I met there were libertarians, and none of them have read these things in Icelandic, and probably they never will. Even though I was told that supposedly the translation of Game of Thrones is actually supposed to be really, really good, and it's really well done. They're just not going to do it. And so, people are consuming a huge amount of material in English. And one of my subscribers, who I got to meet, again, a pleasure to meet these people. He showed me his library, and he goes, here's the books that you recommended, and here's the books that I have on my own, and of course all the titles, English, 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 and if you want to read about politics or economics or any of these other topics, the amount that you can read in Icelandic in print is quite limited. But if you can read English, which they can, obviously you can read anything that's in English, and of course they have shipping there, and so like you can get all these books; they're all available. Um, and so the result is like a very high degree of bilingualism at least. Now, some people are going to speak, in addition to that, they might speak Danish, maybe they'll speak German or French, maybe Chinese, whatever. The third language is very much like the elective language would be. English is not elective. Everyone does it. Everyone does it all the time. Small children do it. Even 8, 9 people you can talk to, even 5, 6 you can talk to, although they might not be able to talk back. Um, Very, very interesting kind of phenomenon that's going on there. Now, it's not like they don't speak Icelandic. I went to a couple parties where I was the only non-Icelandic person there, and when they talk to each other, they speak Icelandic, and they're very comfortable doing that. And it's not like you don't hear it. A couple times when I put on a sweater and was in the less touristy areas and not acting as touristy, I was kind of happy to be mistaken for Icelandic a few times, and people would come and start talking to me in Icelandic, and I'd have to tell them. Basically, all I could say in Icelandic is like, I don't speak Icelandic, and then they switch to English. Even if they were young, even if they were a kid, their English was fluent. So again, if you want to go, don't worry about not speaking English. Another thing, on the flight over, I realized like I had my U.S. passport, but I was started to wonder like, am I supposed to seek any kind of permission to enter Iceland from the Icelandic state? And I thought I remember reading that you didn't need it, and I figured how much they want tourism would mean that they probably wouldn't be many hurdles, and indeed there wasn't. You land in the airport, and there's 2 immigration officials, and they just classic bureaucrats who don't give a shit and are just like literally like rubber stamping everybody, no questions asked, all day long, which I rather like, to be honest. And similarly, when I left, and there's a whole other kind of sob topic here that I guess I'll ease into at this point, which is kind of like the police state, police presence, government presence kind of norm. Um, when I left, there was a lady at the checkpoint, and she had a screen with all these different flags on it of all the different main countries, that she would click. And I noticed her clicking the first time, and something happened. I had to leave security and come back because I needed to get a refund on my VAT tax. There's a value added tax in Iceland, but you can get it refunded if you're a tourist, if you have your receipts and everything. I ended up having to go back through security. But the second time, I noticed that she was just clicking these, and I asked her, how can you tell, what nationality everybody is, so quick? Because she wasn't looking at ID, she was looking at tickets, which wouldn't necessarily tell you where someone was from. And she says, oh, I just click unknown for everyone. Even so, Americans, UK, Chinese, whatever, she just clicks unknown for everybody the entire time, which I thought was great. I mean, whatever, like, um, that they're not really keeping track. The security is much less invasive and police statey and authoritarian than it is in the United States. And I will say that just in general, Iceland is like that. That the police presence is not as intimidating as it is in Iceland. And maybe that's just because I'm aware that the police have only ever killed one person in the history of Iceland, and that one person was apparently on the second floor of a building shooting at people. Um, that's it, and it was apparently a big deal when it happened. Uh, that it's noticeably more relaxed. You walk around the Capitol, you can go up to the Parliament building. Parliament building is like the size of the municipal building in a small town in the United States. It's not like the U.S. Capitol, which is a citadel of authority and power and a temple to, the federal religion, which is very intimidating. I've been to the U.S. Capitol only once, surrounded by, Secret Service people, people in plain clothes, security, uniform security, gun toting, AR-15 toting, cameras everywhere, blah, blah, blah. It's fucking intimidating. And you go there and you can just walk around. And it's like a tourist attraction, and, you don't get any kind of sense of threat or dread or anything. It's just, um, it's not intimidating. It's just very, very laid back. And I think it's interesting. Just the resources of the Icelandic state are it's very difficult. You know, Americans, we live in the United States. The United States government has more resources at its disposal than any government ever has. Um, and that just makes it a lot worse. I mean, it can do things that other states just, even if they wanted to, they really couldn't. I mean, and you go to a place like Iceland, and it's a small society anyway, and the state itself is very, very tiny, and its grasp is quite limited, and that's actually very nice. It's very nice to realize that there's only so much they can do, or so much they even can contemplate doing. There was apparently a year or two ago, maybe a little bit longer. I mean, because Iceland basically does not have a military. They have a police force. They have something of a coast guard that has a few like little tiny ships. They have a troop of soldiers called the Viking Squad that has been deployed. They were deployed to Afghanistan and to Iraq. I don't think they did any actual fighting. And when I'm talking a troop, I'm talking about like 20 guys. It's a very, very small group. They are, like they have literally done things like kill polar bears and suppress drunken riots, and that's kind of like the degree of their like war experience. They had something of a scandal. Uh, the government tried to purchase about 300 modern assault weapons from Norway. These were used; they were modern, but they were used from the Norwegian military. Which what they could possibly need them for is anyone's guess. And when it came out that they had done this, they pawned it off and they said, well, we didn't really buy them. Norway gave them to us as a gift. So it's not like we're spending tax money. It's just something that we were given. And then Norway chimed in and said, that's not true. You do have to pay for them. We're selling them to you. And it was such a big scandal that they ended up giving them back. And I can't help but be gratified at the idea that this massive upscaling of the armaments of the country, which is what 300 assault weapons. I mean, I can find 300 assault weapons at the gun store here in Manchester, any one of several gun stores here in Manchester. Um, the idea that the state it was a scandal for them to acquire these, and that they had to then give them back. Obviously warmed my heart just a little bit. Um, So yeah, you don't get the police brutality. There is a notable lack of sirens. You don't know how much of this is, and again, it's easy to say, well, maybe Icelanders are better. Maybe our governments are. And we had a lengthy debate. I met other libertarians there, but I ended up having a long debate with a guy from Switzerland who was very, very defer to state power whenever possible. And he's like, look, well, our states don't do all these terrible things the U.S. government did. Switzerland doesn't invade, all these other countries, which might be true with Switzerland. It's certainly not true with most of the other NATO nations that do have troops deployed all over the place. Even if they didn't send them to Iraq, they sent them to other places. Um, I said, look, it's not a fair comparison because Iceland or Switzerland or Norway or Sweden, they don't have their states don't have the resources at their disposals to launch aggressive, warfare against other states like Iraq or Iran or Vietnam or any of these other places. But the United States does, and if they did, it's very likely that they would because the states that can do. All right, so like Russia, China, the UK, France, India, the United States, all those countries engage in warfare. They do all kinds of terrible things because they can. And small states, when they don't, it doesn't necessarily mean they're more moral. It means that they're just less capable. Now, it's a little bit more complicated than that when you're a small state and you realize there's no point in having an arms race. Iceland is never going to be, preparing to invade any place else. That's going to change their expectations and what they want to achieve and what their goals are, and so they don't act as aggressively as they otherwise could because there's no point. It doesn't mean that they're more altruistic. It doesn't mean that they're not above corruption. It doesn't mean that they aren't biased. It doesn't mean that even if they attempt to fill out the common good, they aren't going to be swayed by their own preconceptions about what that is and led astray. Um, so I don't want to idolize the place because I don't think it deserves that. There are many cultural aspects about Iceland that I very much enjoy, and there are other cultural aspects that I thought were, um, could be improved upon, at least for my values. Um, like I said, it's this very interesting kind of mix of it's Scandinavian. It was obviously originally settled by Norsemen. by Vikings. It became part of the United Crown of both Norway and then Denmark, and then later of just Denmark. And it retained its status as a colony of Denmark up until the 1940s. During the war, essentially FDR said, okay, we're just going to make Iceland independent. They're very proud of this, by the way, and there's sort of a degree of sensitivity towards this issue where they don't like if you say that they're basically like Denmark or that they're part of Denmark. And it is actually, I know that they're a sovereign nation and everything. It was interesting though because the Capitol building is still adorned with the crown of Denmark. It's has the royal insignia on it, and also the president. I think David Magnuson. Um, his portrait. He's been the president for about 20 years. Interesting character. I'll come back to in a bit. Um, his like official portrait is in a lot of government buildings. I remember in particular when I took the ferry to Vestmannaeyjar, there's a portrait of him there in the office, and he's wearing, of course, it's an official portrait, so he's dressed up, and he's wearing this very ornate, um, royal-looking, bejeweled piece of officialdom. Um, and obviously, Iceland doesn't have a royal family; it never has. And I asked one of my libertarian friends, I was like, it just seemed to me like that had to be some kind of accoutrement of the Danish monarchy. And he goes, yeah, it probably was. And I was like, well, if he's the president of Iceland and Iceland is an autonomous, or not autonomous, but an independent sovereign nation, why is he wearing Danish royal accoutrements in his official photographs? To me, kind of very much sent the messages like there is some kind of sovereignty still vested in Denmark, and he didn't have a good answer. He said he didn't know why, although he admitted that it clearly looked like a Denmark, Danish symbol of, overlordship. So I'm a little bit confused by that. Um, like their ties to Denmark are still strong. There's a lot of I mean, Denmark's one of the few countries where you can take Icelandic in university. A lot of Icelanders go to Denmark either for work or for school or to Norway. Um, so there is this strong historic cultural connection to Scandinavia, and that's where a lot of the socialism comes from. And there's a lot of communitarianism, like we're all a group and we all get along. But that just radically kind of ch not changed so much as what altered with the American presence. I mean, the Americans came, they gave them their independence, or whatever, however you want to describe that. And it wasn't like they were being oppressed by the Danes, although they did. I mean, taxi cab driver who was not a libertarian was going off and off about on and on about how the Danes basically used Iceland as a captive market, that they had all kinds of tariffs and protective, trade restrictions. They didn't allow them to trade with people, and once I guess the people they wanted to trade with the most were the Germans because they had the cheapest goods for the highest quality or whatever. And the Danes didn't allow this, so everything they had to buy had to come from Denmark. So it was, junk and it was more expensive, and classic kind of colonialism. So they were kind of oppressed. I don't know. Um, but then the Americans come, and then the Americans more than politically, just culturally, all these American servicemen there, which of course they intermarried and left that kind of stamp. But the first radio station, the first television station in Iceland were both U.S. military base stations, and you basically have this very vibrant, very large, very competitive, very productive, and culturally powerful society in the United States. All of a sudden just projecting itself right into Iceland, and it's had an enormous cultural impact that's ongoing. So these people are consuming American media, American books, American music. I mean, just listening to the radio. I mean, there are radio stations that play just like a normal radio stations that you hear in the United States, classic rock, oldies, pop music, and they have radio stations that play European stuff, and they have radio stations that play like Icelandic stuff. But it's just very interesting. I remember in particular listening one day driving across the lava fields with Crazy Pants. We were listening to a rap station. Well, I don't know if it was a rap station, but they were playing Icelandic rap. And this guy, I'm not a rap enthusiast, so like I couldn't objectively like critique or gauge how good he was, but it sounded fine to me. It sounded articulate and interesting, and it had a beat to it. And I just remember thinking though, like, how big of a market is there for Icelandic rap? Okay, outside of Iceland is none, and Iceland's a very small market. So this person is never going to make a living. Um, Really, in all probability, he's never going to make a living doing Icelandic rap. The other thing is, there's a lot of rap out there, and it's very unlikely that anyone in Iceland is going to be able to compete with the fact that there's, for every Icelander who does rap, there's 1 or 2 thousand Americans who do rap, or not to mention everybody else in the world. And the chances that that one Icelander in 1,000 is going to be produce a product that's a higher quality or more desirable in terms of marketability than the stuff created by 999 Americans is extremely unlikely. And so consumers of rap are going to be purchasing and listening to and patronizing US producers of rap, not Icelandic ones. And that's just, I use rap as an example, but we could be talking about literature, we could be talking about anything. I mean, George R. R. Martin is probably outselling any Icelandic authors, and that's just again one example. J.K. Rowling, any of these other people, and just the cultural impact I think can't really be minimized. In terms of libertarianism, um, even though it is a bit of a cliche, and I think it's a misnomer, and that a lot of European states kind of project a degree of free market laissez-faire onto the United States that is simply no longer accurate if it ever was. Um, it's still an avenue for libertarian ideas. And for anyone who's interested, there's a fascinating debate that happened, I believe, in 1984. Milton Friedman came to Iceland, and at that point, obviously the United States already had a presence there. The cultural impact that I'm talking about was already well underway, but it was before the internet, it was before mass media, and the degree of cultural penetration was considerably less then than it is now. And you could see that within the Icelandic society there is consensus about socialism and about the role of the state and about free markets and all those things like that, and that the most authoritarian, the people in the Icelandic society with the most status and the most authority all kind of agree. They're all like your classic Scandinavian democratic socialists. And if there were people in Iceland, and surely there were, who maybe didn't believe that or had skepticism about that, there's very little they could say or do because everybody in positions of authority over them was against them. And what could you say to David Magnuson or some professor at the University of Reykjavik? They have more status, they have more authority. You have nobody that you can make an argument and say, but this person who's at least on terms with you agrees with me and not you. And Milton Friedman is basically on several levels above anybody in Iceland in terms of his international fame, his prowess as both a writer, as an economist, and as a debater. I just read one of Thomas Sowell's books. He said, look, Friedman is one of the very rare people. He can write for a layman, he can write for academics, he can basically do it all. He has the capability to go up and stand toe to toe in debate. And there's a great debate. You just type out Milton Friedman like debate in Iceland. It's in English, and he's debating three of like the premier Icelandic people, and one of whom is David Magnuson, who has since been the president for like 25 years, who's the one who's in the pictures that I'm talking about. Interesting guy. He's also the one who vetoed when the economic collapse happened in 2008. The Althing, the parliament in Iceland, actually voted to bail out the banks, and overwhelmingly voted to bail out the banks. And the president, one of the few things he can do is veto, and he vetoed it, even though he said he thought that was the right thing to do. The population at large is very much against it, and he said this needs to go to a vote for the people. So credit to him, I suppose. He vetoed it, but anyway, he was there too. He was one of the three people debating Milton Friedman, and Milton Friedman completely dominant. Just they had no chance against this guy, none. He completely eviscerated them, and I think this was like a seminal, important moment, because all of a sudden, if you were in Iceland, you could say, look, maybe I don't agree with David Magnuson, some highfalutin professor at the University of Reykjavik who got his Marxist education in Copenhagen or wherever else, but this guy agrees with me, and this guy stands above all of you in terms of his international fame and his prowess and his status and everything. He's the top of an American society that is literally 1,000 times more competitive than Icelandic society is. And I think that this really was like a big watershed event, and it gave currency to a lot of ideas that otherwise just for social reasons, wouldn't have had currency. And I don't want to pin too much on this debate. I think it's itself very important, but it's more emblematic of a more general thing. Is that even if your ideas in your small society are alien, if you can point to another society that's clearly very successful and clearly very vibrant, and say, but there's agreement with them, um, you suddenly have more legitimacy. Now, whether you should or not, is that an argument ad populatum or whatever? Sure, it is. I'm not saying it's necessarily logically correct. I'm saying, though, it's in practice, it's true. And I would say there's a couple of parallels between Iceland and the United States that I think are very interesting. They very much consider themselves, well, we're Europeans. New Americans are not so much European, but in a lot of ways, Iceland's isolation from Europe has been longer and more total than the isolation of the United States. Obviously, the United States is farther away from Europe than Iceland is, but it's still isolated. The other thing is, Iceland has a much longer history. Iceland was originally, well, there were Irish monks who settled there long before, and we actually don't know how long before, and we know very little about these Irish monks other than that when the Vikings landed, they killed them all and wiped away whatever we might have learned about their presence there. But that was in the ninth century, in the 800s AD. And Iceland has been separated from Europe ever since. Now, politically, they were reunited with the Norse crown, the King of Norway, in the 1200s, and then later with Denmark. But the amount of immigration to and from and coordinated economic activity between these states was very minimal. Whereas you look at the United States did not have, was only established the earliest colonies in 1607, the ones that lasted anyway. There was a little bit before that. And so, think about that. It's 800 years less time away, less development apart from Europe, with enormous back and forth culturally, economically, socially, population-wise. The United States has had wave after wave of European immigration, that was substantial up until the 20th century, which is not the case in Iceland. So even though culturally there's kind of this tendency to kind of place Iceland closer to Europe than the United States, I'm not sure that this is entirely justified, and this is becoming increasingly true just with the influence of American culture within Iceland. Um, there is definitely like a contingent of Anglo-speaking libertarians in Iceland. They have a Facebook group. They are active. They have Students for Liberty. They're very well read. They are very much, they're just like libertarians around the world. They tend to know a great deal more about the United States than the average foreigner who has very little idea what the United States is really like, or wow, it's all cliches. Since so many libertarians are talking about the United States and details about it, libertarians in other countries are privy to all those conversations and tend to have a much better understanding of a lot of aspects, especially of governance in the United States, than do your average people in other countries. So really, some people ask me if Iceland, maybe could be, one of these potential libertarian enclaves, and I'd say it will definitely has that potential, if for no other reason than the population is so small, and it's already basically laid the groundwork for. I mean, it's very easy. Thousands of libertarians could move there just by buying plane tickets and getting work there, and nobody would know. I mean, and I wanted to talk about this also, like the transient population of like not just tourists, but also workers, mostly who are going to be seasonal, but not necessarily, is huge, and the resources of the Icelandic government are insufficient to track these. So everyone who was staying at my house, I was the only tourist there. Everyone else there was one was there for school, and I think he had like official license, but everyone else there was there working, but none of them had any kind of paperwork or anything like that. And one of them told me that when he'd been hired, they said, well, you do have to have a work permit. It takes a couple weeks, but just start working and we'll take care of it. And they got it done, they said, in like a couple days, which to me indicates a high degree of, I say corruption, but not in a negative sense. You can get stuff done. The house that I lived in was owned by an Icelander. She had grown up there, but she didn't live there any longer. She rented out the entire building, probably making, by my estimate, over $500 or $600 a week in rents. And because this is Airbnb, which is an international firm, there's a good chance that this money was not getting taxed. She was probably paying property taxes on the house, but that's probably it. Since the accounts she was probably using were not in Iceland, or very likely could just not be in Iceland. And the thing is, within Reykjavik itself, you're talking about a large percentage of the households that follow this. So there's a huge there's a huge amount of currency that's flowing into the country that the government can't and doesn't really track. They don't have the resources to. They're not going around to the houses figuring out who's living here, who's staying here, how many people are here, how many of them have permits, how many of them have visas or their equivalent of visas. And the answer is like they're not doing any of that. Um, and so all these businesses that cater to these tourists and these foreign workers, they're in a large degree, they have a high degree of at least financial independence from the state. Now, they're still in Reykjavik. I'm not saying they're above regulations and they're above taxation. That's not true. But since so much of their livelihood is just flowing from outside the country, and it's a flow that the Icelandic government, I'm sure there's people there who wish they could tap into it better. There's not a whole lot they can do about it. And this is kind of a unique scenario because so much of the economy is based off of tourism. Where if you have a country or an economy that's not so heavily based on tourism, this would be much more difficult, I think. But it does give a big part of the economy a much larger amount of autonomy from government regulations, just de facto, because there's so much of it's in foreign currencies, it's in foreign denominations, it's from uh, foreign stockpiles of money and capital. So very interesting that. Now the other second probably biggest industry after tourism is fishing, and that's also interesting too. One of the friends that I met on Westminster works very much in the fishing industry, and he really wanted to talk about fishing rights and property rights on the ocean, and how could that be made to work, and how their being a member of the EU is fucking them because most of the fish they sell go to Russia, and because they're not in the EU, but because they're in NATO, they had to boycott Russia, and now Russia's reverse boycotting them, and they've just lost a huge market for their fish. And I was the whole time wondering, why aren't you worried of the fact that you live on an island that has a volcano on it that erupted 20 years ago and almost killed everyone, and blah blah blah. Not well, in the 70s anyway. Um, and just I didn't say anything. I might as well say it. Like Iceland is stunningly beautiful. There are volcanoes everywhere, glaciers everywhere, waterfalls everywhere, peninsulas, beaches. Just one of my friends there said he worried that the tourism was a fad and that it wouldn't last very long. And so that may be true that it is a fad, but you have to understand that you do actually have stunning natural beauty here that you take for granted because you live here and you grew up here. And to you, seeing a volcano and a glacier and a giant waterfall is like me seeing a cornfield and a hill and a house and a forest. But for most people in the world, that's quite stunning and spectacular and worth note of. And so you won't be disappointed in terms of scenery if you ever decide to go, which I'd recommend people. If you like to travel, definitely check out Iceland. But um, yeah, and a lot of Iceland's kind of national antagonism has actually been focused on fishery disputes. They had what was so-called the Cod Wars with the UK, um, over who got to fish where and settling where the boundaries should be. The system in Iceland is a very complicated one where the they basically have like licenses that they give to a few people who are then able to harvest so many fish, and it's based on a quota that's based on how many employees they have. Um, and it's kind of a mixed system. Definitely could use some reform. Um, there's a lot to be said about how to apply private property, like because non having not private property, you're going to have the tragedy of the commons, and you're going to have all the inherent difficulties with with state control or collective control over resources. The trick with seasteading in this sense is that you have these large the primary value, I mean, owning bits of the sea floor, that might work for mineral rights and aquaculture and stuff like that. When you're talking about actual schools of fish, marine populations of animals, this is actually very tricky because these aren't set in one place. They move around. Where they move isn't always the same. Their ranges shift. That's what he was telling me, is that uh, the ranges of some of these fish are moving into and out to, like there are fish that they couldn't catch before that they can now, and other fish that are becoming much more less common. Um, and it's a very interesting kind of question, uh, how that would work. And I have some ideas. They're just ideas, and I don't know how much they would work. So if you watch this video and I don't explain, it's because I don't know. Kind of an interesting topic, but not one that I don't know. This video has too many tangents anyway to go into that. And not I'm not saying that to imply that I have an answer, because I don't. Um, so yeah, very, very, very fascinating country. Culturally very interesting. What's happening with the influx of American culture, especially, although not exclusively, is interesting. I don't think it's obliterating Icelandic culture. I don't think that people are ceasing to speak Icelandic. There's no impetus to do that. They all still speak Icelandic. They like to speak Icelandic, quite obviously. They have their own cultural norms that are separate, but especially in Reykjavik, and this is less true outside of Reykjavik, but especially in Reykjavik, they're dealing with Americans and English speakers all day. They're speaking it all the time, um, during work anyway, and even in leisure, like when they go and relax, they go to the spa or the pool or whatever. There's going to be a bunch of tourists there, depending on where they go. And I sometimes felt a little self-conscious about that. Like, this person just worked all day. I'm on vacation. This person just worked a 12-hour shift, and or whatever they work, 8 hours, doesn't matter. They just want to come and relax, and there's a whole bunch of guys from Texas sitting here, talking about the fucking oil industry or whatever. Um, Not that I felt bad. I paid a ticket to go there, but it just made you very kind of self-conscious of, this is their country and you're here, and then you realize like there's always foreigners here, and I just wondered what kind of strains that makes. I mean, it's a mint. People are dumping money there. They couldn't have, if they were to wave their hands and say no more tourism, I mean, then their wealth would be diminished enormously, and how that would translate would be, fewer things for them. They'd have fewer cars and fewer clothes and fewer DVDs and fewer movies and less quality food and all this other stuff. They have to import a large amount of their food. Um, and yeah, and I didn't catch that. I didn't experience any people being acrimonious or embittered or anything. But it is interesting because it's clearly an influence on society that's going to have long-term, irrevocable, effects. Which, to be honest, is always true. Society is always changing. Even if you don't have lots of tourists, there's always things that are going on that are altering society. But it's more overt, it's more noticeable, and it's also more alien, I guess would be a word. It's even though they're accustomed to Americans at this point, and I think this is going to get worse. I mean, some of the airlines now are doing very, very lucrative business doing flights. One of the major airlines has just recently started doing flights from Boston to Reykjavik very cheap. And there's just a I mean, I met so many people from Boston specifically in Iceland that there has to be basically a flood, a torrent of people coming from Boston, not necessarily Bostonians. I'm not a Bostonian, but like just dumping there, and it's huge. It's huge. Like if I went on my grinder, half the people in Iceland were not Icelandic. They were foreigners, mostly Americans. Um, and the pressures and the dynamic that produces is very, very interesting. It's very unpredictable also. Like I'm not projecting to say what is or is not going to happen, but it's very interesting. So yeah, I definitely had a great time. Definitely want to go back. There are other kind of side topics that kind of came up when I was there that I do want to address in separate videos. But I know this was a little bit rambly, and it's actually going kind of long even for me. But yeah, if you have any questions, anyone else ever gone, if you are Icelandic and you watch this, I think I pretty much know all of you, but whatever, just say hi. It was very nice to meet all of you. Thank you very much, Crazy Pants. and I forget your YouTube name, but you know who you are, Investment Air, for your hospitality. It was great meeting you guys. It was great meeting other libertarians in Iceland. I met a few who I didn't know before. Um, and really I felt like I made a whole bunch of new friends. And it's always an interesting experience to meet people in person for the first time after having known them for many years online. I've had that happen at Parfest a couple times with subscribers and other people that I knew on Facebook, and going to Iceland was very much akin to that. These people that I've known for a long time, and all of a sudden there you are, and you're having dinner with them or going out to traveling with them, and really, really a cool experience, one that I hope to duplicate in the not too distant future. So, anyway, I think that's going to be all for now, and I'll talk to you all later.